You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is international best-selling author Dr. Caroline Cauchi. Caroline has written 9 novels, including the modern-day fairy tale The Drowning of Arthur Braxton, which was subsequently made into a feature film that won Best UK Feature at the Raindance Film Festival. She is also head of book editing at BubbleCow and is currently the Royal Literary Fund Fellow at Liverpool University. Caroline's latest novel, Mrs. Van Gogh, is the story of 28-year-old Johanna Van Gogh-Bonger, sister-in-law to artist Vincent Van Gogh. It's through her eyes that we meet the Van Gogh brothers, charming Theo, and unstable, drug-addled, starving artist Vincent. What became of Vincent's art after their deaths is thanks, in large part, to Johanna, and yet we know so little about her. Please allow me to introduce Dr. Caroline Cauchi, author of Mrs. Van Gogh. Hello, Caroline. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello. Lovely to meet you.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay. My name is Caroline Cauchi, and I guess, like most writers, I have trouble saying, so even though I paused, I'm a novelist. I'm also an academic, and I lecture in creative writing at LGMU, which is Liverpool University. And I write under 3 different names. So Mrs. Van Gogh is actually my 9th published novel, but it's my first as Caroline Cauchi. I also publish as Caroline Smales for contemporary and experimental fiction. And then I publish as Caroline Wallace for contemporary commercial fiction. So Mrs. Van Gogh is my first historical fiction novel. And in many ways, it almost feels like a debut. So it's absolutely terrifying that it's going to be out in the public in a few weeks' time.
I understand all that. For what it's worth, I loved the book. So
fantastic.
One small opinion in your corner.
Yeah, I'm winning. I should quit now then, yeah.
No, not at all. So do you have a personal connection to Paris or to France yourself?
Oh, I have a love of all things French, which goes back to possibly my teenage years, really. I studied A-levels in England, like a lot of people do, and I was actually doing geography, English, and sociology. They were my A-level choices. And I'd always loved languages. I have a Maltese mum and an English dad, so I've had this kind of love of all things linguistics from an early age. But anyway, it's quite embarrassing to admit this, but we're going to go with it. I'm going to be truthful. I was doing geography and I quite liked a boy who was in the French class. So I decided to switch to do French, to study French, and then became so I fell in love with the French language to the point where I was going to go to university to study French. And then rather than going straight to university at 18, I actually ran away from home because I'd fallen in love with a French boy and lived in France for a year where I kind of fell even more in love with the language, but then ended up going to university to study English literature. So I don't know quite how it happened, but my love of all things French kind of continued through my degree. And I've been back and forward to Paris for a long time, but I was kind of always looking for the right novel to set in France. Actually, the novel before this was going to be set in France, and it ended up being set in Liverpool instead. Totally extreme.
Not the same.
Yeah, but then this opportunity came up to obviously set a novel in France in 1888, which was a major challenge. And the next novel I'm going to write is also going to be set in France. So it feels like I'm going to be there for a while.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Do you get to come and do in-person research?
I do. And I'm going to be hopefully in the next few months. And I think it might be of interest to you because I've obviously looked at some of the places you've been visiting and it's going to be linked to Rodin.
Oh.
Yeah.
I love Rodin.
So do I.
Okay, very interesting. Well, I will keep that in the back of my mind. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about Mrs. Van Gogh. Can you tell us a little bit about what the story is about?
Yeah, I think maybe to tell you more about the story, it might be useful to kind of go back to how I found the seed of the idea. If it's because it's something that I'd never known about. So the seed starts for me back in, I think about 5 years ago. I was in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam with my daughter. And I don't know if you've been to the museum before, but as you walk through it, you the way that the paintings and the sketches are presented, you see the decline. And it got to the top and I was in tears and, I've always been a fan of Van Gogh's work anyway. But then when I looked around, I saw this kind of small plaque about his family tree. And I looked and I saw Johanna's name on the plaque. And I was like, okay, this is a small sign mentioning his sister-in-law. Perhaps, what is this? Because I'd never heard of her before. So then, obviously, novelist brain flicks in and I kind of think, okay, so I know that Van Gogh dies penniless in 1890, little recognition. But then, as I've been looking around the museum, there's kind of this, okay, so 11 years later, his work's being exhibited in Paris in a major retrospective. And it's like, well, how did that happen? How did we get from Vincent dying penniless to being recognised? And then his growth to be celebrated as he is today. And I honestly had never heard of Johanna and I'd never heard of her influence in the story. So for me, that's how it's suddenly like, right, okay, all of my novels, everything that I write is about giving voice to people who've been silenced. And I thought, I need to tell her story. The world needs to know Johanna's influence in bringing Vincent's art to us. So in some ways, I became almost like a custodian for her story. And at the same time, I was lecturing at the time and I didn't have a PhD. I had a master's in creative writing at the time and I put forward a proposal for PhD and got a scholarship for 3 years study to explore how creative women, often creative women who have been fundamental in helping men rise to fame, are ignored or silenced, and what's being done within the feminist movement to bring their stories into kind of contemporary novels and films. So I'm looking at kind of creative practice. So for the last 4 years, I've kind of devoted myself entirely to Jo. And the result is this novel, which is obviously fiction. And then I've done creative practice and explored the role of female creative women throughout history and how they've been silenced as well. That was a really long-winded response to get to why I've written the novel. But the novel, Mrs. Van Gogh, is showing Jo's role in Vincent's rise to fame.
I can see an obvious connection with Rodin as well, and where that mystery woman in the background would come in there too, which you do touch upon a bit in this book as well. Yeah,
I talk about Camille in this one, but in studying Camille and looking at her role in Rodin's rise to fame, I came across Rose Beret as well, and she's a silenced woman who was a constant obviously throughout his life, and then the other women who come and go. And I think the thing with creative women and difficult women, and these women throughout history, I mean, to be honest, it still happens now. This isn't a new phenomenon, is it? I'm trying to shine a light on like a male-centered account of history, to look at her story and to kind of put these women back in their rightful place. But I'm not an art historian. What I'm actually trying to do is go, look, these are the mistakes of our past, but look how they're still happening now. How many creative women are being silenced now, and we think it's a new phenomenon, but it's not. It's been going on for centuries.
Yeah, it's true. We think of art and artists in the past as all being men, but not only is that not true, but where it is true, it's because women were forced to not be artists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, because I did a lot of research around this, so art historian Knocklin, I think it was 1971, she wrote an essay about why have there been no great female artists. And that led to this kind of ripple through the feminist movement to look at creative women who had been ignored, and there were creative responses to that. So Judy Chicago is, a key fundamental person within this movement who did the dinner party and set these place settings for all of these women. But then she went further, and it wasn't just creative women, it was women in social science and other kind of scientific aspects, and made us look at all these women that have been erased. And I guess that what I'm trying to do is add to the conversation, to look at creative women and to look at these. There is a kind of movement within the publishing industry at the moment for her story, for the reimagining of women who've been erased. And I'm adding to the conversation. But in terms of, Van Gogh, I think there's so many of us who, and I did it, who never kind of thought about, we know his story. We know that he died penniless. But, so many of us don't question how this success has happened. And now also with Van Gogh, especially, it's within our everyday understanding of him, because Johanna was responsible for translating all his letters and also making sure that the artist and his words became part and parcel of the same thing. So his kind of tragic existence was shown to us through his paintings, but also through his words. So if you go to an immersive experience now, you walk around the paintings, but the words flash up. And that's because of Johanna. So the ripple, it's still there. Others have obviously made sure that Vincent remains and is part of our art history, but we still have those reminders of Johanna, yet people don't know her name.
It's so interesting because I never questioned it either. I knew that Vincent died, tragically. But I just assumed it was his brother who had brought his work to the forefront, but his brother dies 6 months later.
Yeah, so Vincent dies in the July. Theo in the October collapses from mental exhaustion. Later we learn that it was syphilis, so he died in a similar way to Vincent. And he is within a mental institution from the October, and then he dies in January. So basically, Johanna, within the 21 months that she's married, she, I think she's 27 and she has a 1-year-old son, and she's a widow, and she's inherited over 400 paintings, all of his sketches, all of his letters, Vincent's letters. And suddenly she has this huge weight of responsibility on her shoulders and also needs to earn a living.
Yeah. Well, and also she's fighting against the currents of the time because people aren't interested in his work then. So she has to say, yes, this has value and listen to me, even though I'm a woman. Look at what he's done here. This is something new.
Absolutely. And at the time, everyone was saying, just spread his work around the city. Nobody cares. Just get rid of it. And she was saying, no, she'd been taught from Theo. She'd watched him as an art dealer and decided, no, I'm going to keep these paintings together. And she had this strategy where she was going to exhibit some of the greater works alongside some of the smaller works, sell those off and keep, get the interest there through these greater works and keep this collection of art together, which was, unheard of at the time as well. But yeah, nobody suspected this woman with a babe on her hip, basically, but she had this strength and determination within grief and loss and, the tragedy that she'd experienced in such a short amount of time as well. She's an incredible woman.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. I can't imagine that there was very much that was written about her already. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did?
Yeah, obviously this is all, when I'm writing this, I actually went to New York because I'd got a lead for her being in New York, and I'd gone to New York, and on my flight back, I think it was the next day that lockdown happened.
Oh.
So I was trying to do my research during lockdown. I got in touch with the Van Gogh Museum to see if I could have access to her archive, but I was told that there wasn't a Johanna archive, that her story was part of Vincent's story. Since then, her diaries were embargoed, but they've now been released online. This was all during the time. And although she kept a diary from when she was 15, her diaries from her time with Theo don't exist. Or yeah, I know. Or they haven't, or they've been lost, or they're just not being made accessible to the public. A lot of the diary had cuts through it and patches kind of scribbled out. And then her diary starts again after Theo's death.
Interesting.
So there are lots of gaps. And this is where, I need to stress the fact that I'm not an art historian. And in a lot of ways, I'm writing into these gaps in terms of creative freedom. There's a path where I have to consider this kind of ethical, moral responsibility that I have to make sure that I tell her story in a way that is respectful, in a way that I'm hoping the Van Gogh family don't hate, but kind of writing into the gaps. So there are like clues there. There are certain things like, I know Vincent's timeline. Everyone knows Vincent's timeline. So the day that he actually chops off his ear is the day that he receives an engagement announcement from Joe and Theo. So the 23rd of December, 1888. And we know that that's truthful because the first painting that Vincent creates during his recovery has the envelope with the postmark and the date of that announcement within it. So although there are lots of stories around why Vincent may have chopped off his ear, well, here's another one because, on that day that he gets this engagement announcement, and also at the time, Theo was Vincent's wallet. So Vincent, we know this from Vincent's letters. He sent kind of shopping lists of what he wanted and what he needed, and Theo would fund that. And perhaps he was worried that his life was going to change if he married Joe. So there's lots of things, lots of questions that I could kind of write into, but trying to stick as close as possible to the timeline. And at the time, actually, I had an agent at the time, and I got in touch with her and said, look, I've got this brilliant idea. Like, I'm in love with Johanna. Here are all the points. And her response at the time was, okay, but can you up the stakes a little bit? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, okay, well, how about you rewrite the story, the timeline, and say that on the day that Joe's getting married to Theo, Vincent turns up at her house and rapes her, and she doesn't know who the father of the child is. And, that would make like this love triangle going through. And there was a moment where, and she's like, they'll make it a really commercial novel. And there was this moment where I had to think, well, wait a minute, what's my ethical, moral responsibility here? Because, how many of us read a book or watch a program and don't, I do, but don't Google to find out more about this person? How many people would read the book and think, oh, that's the truth? Vincent raped her. And, I would be rewriting her history in a way that was detrimental to the Van Gogh family name. So I had to make a decision. I actually don't have that agent anymore as well, so it was like an ethical, moral decision. And this need to, it's totally different experience writing this novel to any of my other novels, because I've kind of got Joe sitting on my shoulder all the way through, and although I have creative freedom to write into the gaps, I don't, because I have to think about her as a real person rather than as a character within a novel.
Yeah, you can't throw out the name Van Gogh without people having expectations and people attaching things to that. And that actually leads me to one of my questions, which is talking about Vincent. I've always known of him as being quote unquote crazy and very depressed, perhaps. But the Vincent that you paint, pardon the pun,
nice,
is a bit vulgar, a bit lecherous.
Yeah.
Where did this idea come from?
It actually came from research into his time at the Yellow House, and which is true. So there was a petition signed by everyone within the village. And if you actually look at the petition, they cite reasons. And those reasons are like he would walk into the house, he would be inappropriate with women. And obviously I wanted to kind of show this additional decline within him. And the idea that Joe steps into the Van Gogh brothers' lives for a very short time. And in that time, it is chaos and there's this madness kind of evolving and seeping into every single meeting. But then later on, when she reads the letters that Theo and Vincent have kept, she sees a Vincent that she's never met before. And it's not the same Vincent in the latter stages of his life. You know, there is like this deep connection between the brothers. So I wanted to kind of have that contrast, because the reader question that I was asking was, you know, I wanted someone to read it and go, but why would she devote her life to him? And that would be because the Vincent that she sees, why would she devote her life to this man? But it's to do with this relationship and love that the brothers have, which has been explored within other novels and films as well. So yeah, it was based in a truthful.
That's so interesting. That petition blew my mind, that the entire town was like, no, get rid of this man. We don't like him.
I think we can't possibly understand the behaviour, because nowadays, obviously, it wouldn't be allowed, would it? You know, it would be kind of within the first walking into somebody's house, something would be done. But this kind of, it was okay, not okay, but it was this eccentric mad artist in a male figure. But then you have the contrast to female artists of any kind of hysteria, or, you know, these women being like, look at Camille Claudel, you know, she is locked away for 30 years of her life, you know, after having the affair with Rodin. You know, I know it's more complicated than that, but still there were different standards for what is seen as acceptable behavior or crazy or artistic.
Yeah, and it seems like he had a lot of leeway anyway, you know. When he is inappropriate with Joe, Theo just says, okay, well, I'm going to move him to another place. You know, we'll just not solve the problem, just push it away a little bit. Yeah,
and I think also because of their relationship. So I put in the novel how sometimes people would get close to Theo and then he would, you know, entertain women, and then he would grow bored of them or not want to have a relationship with them, and he would pass them on to Vincent. And then when these women became hysterical, you know, because they had a voice and wanted to understand what was happening, because, you know, Theo was an emerging art dealer. He had money. He was respected within the society, you know. So when these women are being passed over to Vincent to entertain them, of course, you know, they're going to have opinions on that. You know, some of them are, but that did happen within their lifetime as well. So I think Theo accepted some of Vincent's behaviour, perhaps out of some of the decisions he made himself.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was something I was going to ask you about too, about whether, like, how much truth there was to that, because that's also quite shocking, just to say, like, okay, I'm done with you. My brother can have you now.
Yeah. Yeah, so I actually took that because I found a letter between them, and it referred to her with the initial S. So then within the novel, I created a character called Sarah. Maybe I gave her modern sensibilities in some way. Like she didn't want to let Theo go quite as easily. But yeah, there was somebody with the initial S who was passed to Vincent around the time of Joe as well.
So I know that you crafted a lot of what happened in this book, including the jumping off point. Can you talk a little bit about Johanna's coming to Paris, and why did you decide to start there?
Yeah, this is where it's a novel, it's creative. So yeah, I read through Joe's diaries, and I actually found an out-of-print book that showed letters between Joe and Theo as well. It's gorgeous, gorgeous book called Brief Happiness. And I kind of looked at her diaries. So their timeline then. So Joe meets Theo, and Theo is a friend of her brother. So he's Vincent's younger brother. So they're quite young at the time. And Joe meets him. And after 2 meetings, Theo asks Joe to marry him. And Joe is absolutely horrified. And also because at the time she was just coming out of a relationship where she felt really humiliated. She'd fallen in love with the wrong man. And so this is truthful. So she'd fallen in love with somebody who didn't. It was unrequited. He kept her hanging around. He kept making promises that weren't going to happen. And she basically left teaching. She was a teacher at the time. She left teaching because she'd had what was classed as some nervous kind of breakdown of sorts. And she hadn't felt that she was able to teach anymore, and she'd left the school. So I'd kind of seen that and thought about the timeline and tried to figure out how I could get Jo into Paris, because I wanted to set the novel in Paris. And also I didn't want to have too many jumps around within a short word count as well. So this was where the kind of fabrication, the creativity comes on, where I have Jo arrive in Paris after a relationship, an inappropriate relationship, as in a relationship outside of being chaperoned and outside of, she's been caught in an embrace with another teacher, and she gets sent to Paris to be with her brother. So it's kind of playing on the truth, but twisting it to kind of fit with the narrative to get her into Paris so that I can use the Parisian backdrop. The Eiffel Tower is being built at the time, and I can show the passage of time by this Eiffel Tower going up and kind of absorb myself within Parisian society, which was so hard to do. All the research and finding out like it was just such a different creative process. I couldn't just, when I'm writing contemporary novels, we can just write and write and write. If you're writing historical fiction, you're stopping to research facts and find out, the color of the dress or the style of the dress to fit the year and things like that.
And you had to research things like syphilis and absinthe and all of these other crazy things too that I imagine aren't normal for you to research.
No, not at all. But I just fell in love with her. I fell in love with Jo. And it was, it made me think about all the kind of male gatekeepers to creative women's lives. And just thinking about what she went through and her story and how strong she was, and this kind of beautiful story, and trying to make it sound convincing, and I'm sure that, there'll be people, I read an early review, and someone said, they were disappointed because it wasn't all true. And I'm thinking, but I'm not writing a nonfiction book about her because I can't, because I don't have access to enough of her archive, which must exist, So I've had to try and develop fiction around her and around her life, and, to bring her into the public domain. And the book's going to be published internationally. And I'm thinking, it'll be nice that there'll be a few people around the world who are going to hear of Jo's story. And if they tell somebody else, and then there's just this ripple of Jo's name being spoken aloud. So that's my aim. But, like I said, I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist.
Well, and you're clear in the author's note at the end, too, which parts are the ones that you took some liberties with and which parts are things that are factual. And I think a book like this that gives voice to someone who hasn't had one and also sparks your interest. So maybe you want to go do your own research on who this woman is. I don't think that's a bad thing.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So my final question for you is, in doing all of this research and learning all that you did about Vincent, has the way that you viewed his paintings changed?
Maybe, because there are certain ones, like I found out that when Starry Night came out, the reception was really negative about it. I didn't realize that there were more than one sunflowers. There are things like, I don't know, we know like the main stories. Then obviously Almond Blossom, that was painted for Jo's baby, who was named after Vincent. So I think I have an appreciation of the art. And also it's made me think of the letters alongside the art and how adding an artist's biography to the art, how for me it enhances it, it adds depth to it, whereas other people, I guess, would say, no, you should be able to experience the art without knowing anything about the artist. But I think in Vincent's case, words are powerful, and having his words alongside his art, I think that they tell the story of his life, and you can plot his life through the paintings, and you can plot the tragedy through that as well, and that's all because of Jo. You know, she's told us Vincent's story by combining his words and his art, and that's a gift. It's a gift to all of us now.
Yeah, I love that. I think for someone like Vincent, who isn't painting intellectually or isn't trying to create something new, but is just painting very emotionally, knowing the stories behind them, knowing where in his life these paintings were produced, it was fascinating to me. I loved learning. I loved having the paintings that I know so well in my mind sprinkled into the narrative when he created them. I loved that.
Yeah, I just think it just adds a depth. So for me, I mean, since I've been writing about Van Gogh, honestly, everybody buys me Van Gogh presents. I think I am like merchandise queen of Van Gogh at the moment. And I love it. I think it just kind of, I look at things and I think of the stories. I can see the words within his letters to match them. And I feel really fortunate to have had this opportunity to learn more about Vincent. I've never written a novel like this before, you know, where I get given words to, then it's a springboard for my own. It's just a completely different experience. And I'm hoping that people will read the book and kind of understand that I see myself as Jo's custodian. Yeah, so I'm just here to kind of show you a little bit more about her life. That's my aim.
Well, to that end, would you mind reading a little bit of your book to us?
Absolutely. I'm going to read the beginning. Not quite at the beginning. First of all, there's a report which kind of raises the question as to who Mrs. Van Gogh is. But I'm going to start this in summer 1888, Paris. Railway carriages. Sister, one word and I'm transformed into an ugly, sobbing mess outside Gare du Nord. Lord knows what the other travellers must think. Small trunk dropped to my feet, tears decorating my cheeks. I think I even release a tiny mew-like whimper. My handkerchief's pushed too far past the tight cuffs of my bodice for me to reach, but really I'm no longer trying to get it. I see him, my brother, tall, bowler hat in hand, thrust above the crowd, calling me, fighting against the stream of passengers from the train. I stand still, watching as he weaves past the stone columns outside the station. Other travellers rush along, porters wobbling behind, straining to juggle too many travel cases. Hustle, bustle, shouts of au revoir, bowler hats and beggars, bonnets, laughter, top hats and barefooted children. Ladies raise their parasols to prevent the sun from touching their skin, and some even have fans, desperate for a breath of air. I have nothing to protect me from the afternoon sun. Languages I know, dialogues I don't quite recognise. It finally feels real, though. I'm in Paris. You're here, I say, the words stuttering out with my gulps. Oh my, such heat, he says. He dabs at his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Andres has what others consider a youthful face. Oval in shape, blemish-free, overly prominent ears, and end bristles of his moustache wishing to curl. Were you waiting long? I'd have been here early, but Mama's letter only just arrived a few hours ago, and there was so much to organise. So they've told you? I ask. Andres nods, his eyes jumping to each passerby, not meeting mine. That starts me off again. Snot and tears galore, the shame, the embarrassment, the huge mess I've made of my life. I lift the sleeve of my blouse to wipe my eyes, but Andres thrusts his silk handkerchief at me. I take it, dab at my eyes and cheeks, then blow my nose so hard that it toots like a trumpet. I hold out the handkerchief to my brother, but he shakes his head. Andres pulls me to him. He plants a kiss on my forehead before placing his arm around my shoulder. It'll be all right, he says. I can never go back to teaching, I say. A young porter collides with my huge bustle, the small travel case and its teetering bundle falling to the pavement with a clump. "Pardon, mademoiselle," he says. Eyes down, he bows slightly, and that makes the remaining cases topple forward. He pulls back to steady his load. The boy's flustered, young, closer to a babe than an adult. "My first day," he mumbles in rapid French. I can't help but smile. "Mine too," I say in Dutch, but I don't think he understands. "This bustle, it's too large for Paris," I say grudgingly. I swear people are pointing and laughing. I turn to show Andres. It juts out like a shelf, making my silhouette appear like the hind legs of a horse. The station's clock strikes 4 o'clock as Andres begs and picks up the fallen luggage, balancing back on the leaning tower of leather cases before the boy lurches off. "Do you hate me?" I ask. "Don't be silly," he says. "You're my favourite person in the world." Pa does. He says I've thrown away my education and brought shame upon us all. "There'll be other occupations," my brother says. He picks up my trunk and nods for me to follow him back through the crowd.
Beautiful. Thank you. So normally I would ask what's next for you, but you've already sort of dangled that in front of us. Is there anything else you can tell us about your Rodin novel?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm writing 2 novels.
Oh,
now. Yeah.
Fabulous.
My publisher suggested another novel to me and asked if I'd like to write it. So I've got the Rodin novel, which is obviously, it's going to be from the viewpoint of Camille and Rose. Maybe Gwen Johns, I'm not sure yet.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at with that one. And then I'm going to write another novel, which I'm just starting to research at the moment to get an idea, which is, I don't think I can say too much, but it's about a Canadian woman who was a stunt daredevil.
Ooh.
Yes. That's all I can say.
I love it.
But it's the silence voice, of a woman.
Amazing. Well, I will definitely look for both of those.
Oh, thank you.
Speaking of which, where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Okay, so my kind of full name online would be Caroline Cauchi-Smales. So I have a website, which is carolinesmales.co.uk. I am on Twitter at Caroline_S, and I'm on Instagram at Caroline Smales.
Yeah, perfect. So, and I'll include links to all of that so people can find you in all your many iterations.
Thank you. It's very complicated.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me along. I love the fact that I'm almost in Paris as well, which is extra special. I'll be in Paris in a couple of months, hopefully, to do some research. I might drop you a line and see if you've had a cup of tea while I'm there.
I would love that. Please do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Dr. Caroline Cauchi for such a lovely conversation. You can find Caroline on Instagram at Caroline_Smales, on Twitter at Caroline_S, and on her website at carolinesmales.co.uk. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with author and podcaster Shani Silver about her book, A Single Revolution. Don't look for a match, light one. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. Please remember to rate and review us and also tell a friend. The more people who know about this podcast, the more we'll be able to grow and the more I'll be able to share fabulous books and their authors with you. Join the Storytime Book Club, which welcomes authors who have been featured on the podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio for more information. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next week, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.